In the world of Brazilian football, goalkeeper Bruno Fernandes was a rising star, fame, fortune, and fans at his feet. But behind the glory hid a chilling secret. When a young woman vanished without a trace, the truth that followed would expose one of Brazil's darkest and most shocking crimes. In Brazil, football isn't just a sport. It's part of the nation's identity, a religion of its own. Stadiums roar with chants, and young boys grow up dreaming of wearing the yellow jersey. Among those dreamers was Bruno Fernandes das Dores de Souza, known to everyone simply as Bruno. Born in 1984 in Minas Gerais, he came from humble beginnings. He worked his way up through smaller clubs before becoming the star goalkeeper for Flamengo, one of Brazil's most famous football teams. By his mid-20s, Bruno had fame, money, and influence. He was seen as one of the best goalkeepers in the country, even tipped for a future spot on the national team. But behind the success, his personal life was full of chaos, pride, and bad decisions that would soon destroy everything he had built. In 2009, Bruno met Elisa Samudio. She was a young woman in her mid-20s, originally from Mato Grosso do Sul, who had moved to Rio de Janeiro hoping to work as a model. Elisa was attractive, outspoken, and determined. Their paths crossed at a party, and what began as a casual encounter quickly turned into a brief relationship. Soon after, Elisa became pregnant and claimed Bruno was the father. That's where the trouble started. Bruno denied responsibility and wanted nothing to do with her or the child. Elisa, however, refused to stay quiet. She went public about her pregnancy and filed a paternity suit against him. At first, the situation seemed like another celebrity scandal, a famous athlete accused of neglecting a former partner. But things took a darker turn. Elisa told friends and police that Bruno had threatened her before. In one earlier incident, she said he and his associates had tried to force her to have an abortion, warning her that she would disappear if she didn't. Despite this, Elisa stood her ground. She wanted her child to have a father, and she wanted the legal system to recognize it. Her determination became a source of anger for Bruno, who feared the public embarrassment and the financial responsibility that would come with a child support case. By 2010, Bruno was 25 years old, at the height of his career. He was admired by fans, but carried himself with arrogance. Those close to him described him as controlling, temperamental, and used to getting his way. His inner circle included his cousin, Sergio Rosa Sales, and his longtime friend and driver, Luiz Enrique Ferreira Romeo, known as Macareo. Both men were fiercely loyal and would do almost anything for him. Another key figure, who would later become central to the case, was Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, a former police officer nicknamed Bola. He was known for his violent reputation and alleged connections to criminal activities. The tension between Bruno and Elisa grew worse as her pregnancy advanced. She gave birth to a baby boy in late 2009, naming him Bruninho. When Elisa sought financial support, Bruno's lawyers fought back, denying paternity. Elisa, now a single mother with few resources, decided to go to the media and tell her story. She spoke openly about Bruno's behavior, the threats she received, and her plan to prove paternity through DNA testing. For Bruno, this was a nightmare. His carefully built image as a respected athlete was in danger. He was determined to silence her once and for all. In early June 2010, Elisa received an unexpected call. It was from Macareo, Bruno's driver. He told her that Bruno wanted to talk, that he was ready to settle things and recognize his son. Elisa was skeptical but hopeful. She believed maybe Bruno had finally decided to take responsibility. She agreed to meet him, bringing along her 5-month-old baby. That decision would lead her into a trap she never escaped. According to later investigations, Elisa was picked up in Rio de Janeiro and driven to Minas Gerais, hundreds of kilometers away, under the pretense of reconciling with Bruno. Witnesses would later confirm that during this time, she was held at a house connected to Bruno. The property was located in the city of Esmeraldas, near Belo Horizonte, remote enough for no one to hear screams or see what was happening. Inside, she was kept against her will, beaten and threatened. The baby was reportedly kept alive and cared for by one of Bruno's relatives, while Eliza was subjected to repeated acts of violence and intimidation. Bruno himself was not always present, but his orders were followed. Messages, calls, and witness statements later showed that he was aware of everything. He wanted Eliza gone permanently. During this time, his cousin Sergio and his driver Macareo helped control the situation, making sure no one outside the group knew where Eliza was. Bola, the ex-cop, was brought in later. The man prosecutors would later say was responsible for killing her. As days passed, Eliza's friends and family became worried. She stopped answering her phone and disappeared from social media. The last time she was seen alive was in early June 2010. Bruno continued training and playing matches as if nothing had happened. His calmness in public made the situation even more chilling. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. A few people close to him began to suspect something terrible had happened. Weeks later, the story exploded. Police received an anonymous tip linking Bruno to Eliza's disappearance. They launched a formal investigation. The media immediately seized on it. A beloved goalkeeper connected to a missing woman who claimed he was the father of her child. Cameras surrounded Bruno's house. Fans demanded answers, and reporters followed every move. At first, Bruno denied any involvement, telling the press that Eliza had left with friends and that he had no idea where she went. But investigators were already uncovering inconsistencies. Eliza's car was found abandoned. Her belongings were still inside, along with baby supplies. Then, a major discovery changed everything. Her baby, Bruninho, was found alive with one of Bruno's relatives. That moment shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a suspected murder. The child became living proof that Eliza's story was real, that she had indeed been with Bruno before she vanished. As the investigation continued, more details came out. One of Bruno's accomplices began to talk, describing what happened in the days leading up to and following Eliza's disappearance. The story that emerged was horrifying. The group had lured her to Minas Gerais, kept her captive, and then handed her over to Bola, who allegedly strangled her to death. Her body was dismembered and disposed of in a gruesome manner, reportedly fed to dogs to ensure it could never be found. Police never recovered her remains. Bruno's career was collapsing in real time. Sponsors dropped him, Flamengo suspended his contract, and public outrage grew louder each day. Fans who once cheered his name now called him a murderer. The country watched, stunned, as new evidence came to light. His cousin Sergio and driver Macareo were arrested, followed by Bola. Each arrest brought new testimony. Each testimony brought new horror. Bruno still maintained his innocence, but his calm, detached demeanor only made people more suspicious. He continued to claim that Eliza had vanished on her own, though by now no one believed him. The press called it one of the most shocking crimes in Brazilian football history. What had started as a personal dispute between two young people, a football star and a struggling mother, had spiraled into a brutal case of kidnapping, murder, and betrayal. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, the full truth of what happened to Eliza was still to come. The investigation was far from over, and the confessions that would seal Bruno's fate were still waiting to be heard. As the police investigation deepened, the perfect image Bruno Fernandes had built around himself started to crumble. His name, once linked to football glory, now appeared on front pages beside words like murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Brazil, a country obsessed with football, was stunned. Fans couldn't believe that the national team's hopeful goalkeeper could be connected to such a gruesome crime. But for detectives working the case, the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Every new lead pointed directly to Bruno and the people closest to him. The first real break in the investigation came when police managed to track down Bruno's cousin, Sergio Rosa Sales. Sergio was young, in his early 20s, loyal but naive. Under questioning, his story began to unravel. At first, he denied any involvement. But as officers pressed him, details started slipping out, enough for investigators to realize he knew more than he was saying. They also questioned Bruno's driver and close friend, Luis Enrique Ferreira Romeo, known as Macareo. He had been seen with Eliza around the time she disappeared and was believed to have lured her to the house in Minas Gerais. Like Sergio, he denied everything at first, but police knew they were on the right track. Detectives pieced together a timeline based on phone records, witness statements, and testimonies from people who had seen Eliza before she vanished. It became clear that Bruno's driver, Macareo, had arranged for Eliza to travel from Rio de Janeiro to Minas Gerais under the pretense that Bruno wanted to talk about their son and reach an agreement. But what was meant to look like reconciliation was actually a plan to kidnap her. Once Eliza arrived, she was taken to a remote house in Esmeraldas, a property connected to Bruno, and held captive. The investigators discovered that during her captivity, Eliza was beaten and humiliated. Witnesses later described how she was tied up and threatened by several people. Some of those people were part of Bruno's inner circle, men who worked for him and relied on his money and influence. During those days, Bruno reportedly came and went, continuing to play for Flamengo while the crime unfolded. His ability to act normal in public, while such a horrific act took place in private, was one of the things that most disturbed investigators. The key to the case was the child. When police found Eliza's baby alive with Bruno's relatives, it tied everything together. It proved that Eliza had been with Bruno's people just before she vanished. The baby became the silent witness to the crime, too young to speak, but powerful enough to expose a trail of lies. DNA tests confirmed that Bruno was indeed the father, something he could no longer deny. The discovery of the child shifted the entire investigation. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was murder. While the media covered every twist of the story, the pressure on Bruno mounted. Police interrogated him repeatedly, but he remained calm, insisting he had nothing to do with Eliza's disappearance. He claimed she was trying to ruin his reputation. But behind closed doors, detectives were gathering enough evidence to build a solid case. They found bloodstains, eyewitness accounts, and testimony from people who had seen Eliza at the house in Esmeraldas. Each clue painted a clearer picture. Bruno knew exactly what was happening. In July 2010, police arrested Bruno, his driver Macareo, his cousin Sergio, and the ex-cop Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, known as Bola. Bola's involvement took the case into even darker territory. A former military police officer in his 40s, he was feared in the underworld of Belo Horizonte. People whispered that he ran a kind of private justice business, dealing with those who needed to disappear. He was accused of being the one who killed Eliza and disposed of her body. According to later statements, she was strangled inside Bola's house, her body dismembered, and the remains fed to dogs so that no evidence could ever be recovered. It was a crime almost impossible to imagine. Once Bruno and his accomplices were in custody, the police released more details to the public. They shared portions of testimonies and evidence, and the story spread across Brazil. News outlets ran 24-hour coverage, turning the case into a national obsession. Protesters gathered outside police stations demanding justice for Eliza. Former fans burned Bruno's jerseys in the streets. Sponsors that once lined up to be associated with him now rushed to cut all ties. For many, it was unthinkable that a man so successful, with a promising career, could be capable of such a crime. Inside the prison, Bruno tried to maintain his composure. He was confident that his fame would protect him. He gave brief statements to reporters, claiming his innocence and saying he had faith in God. But his calm tone and cold expressions did little to convince the public. The prosecutors were preparing a case that painted him not just as a participant, but as the mastermind behind everything. Meanwhile, Eliza's family struggled with grief and anger. They had no body to bury, no clear proof of her final moments, only the testimonies of those involved. Her mother took custody of the baby, vowing to raise him and keep his mother's memory alive. The case also opened a nationwide conversation about domestic violence and the way women were treated when they stood up against powerful men. For many Brazilians, Eliza's story was more than a crime. It was a reflection of a society where fame and money often silenced victims. Months passed as the legal process moved slowly. Investigators spent long hours building their case, trying to ensure that Bruno and the others could not escape justice. Witnesses were protected, statements verified, and evidence carefully examined. Each new revelation made the story darker. There were reports that Bruno's driver, Macareo, had confessed to helping plan the kidnapping, that he had transported Eliza, and that Bruno was aware of her death. Yet, without a body, prosecutors faced challenges. Defense lawyers argued that there was no concrete proof of murder, only hearsay and circumstantial evidence. But the testimonies of the accomplices and the forensic evidence at the crime scene painted a damning picture. By late 2010, the story had become one of the most infamous criminal cases in Brazil's history. Bruno, once a national hero, was now the face of betrayal and brutality. His career was over. Flamengo officially cut all ties, and other clubs refused to touch him. As he sat in a prison cell awaiting trial, the man who had once guarded goals now faced a lifetime behind bars. His former teammates refused to speak about him, and even his fans turned their backs. But the case wasn't finished. There were still confessions to be made, trials to be held, and sentences to be delivered. The investigation had uncovered enough to link Bruno and his associates to Eliza's disappearance, but the full truth, who did what, when and why, was still emerging. What had started as a love affair between a famous goalkeeper and a young model had turned into one of Brazil's darkest true crime stories. And soon, the court would hear the chilling confessions that would confirm the worst. The courtroom was packed when Bruno Fernandes das Dores de Souza finally faced trial. Reporters filled every seat, cameras surrounded the courthouse, and people lined the streets outside. The once celebrated goalkeeper now wore prison clothes and heavy handcuffs. The man who used to be cheered by thousands entered the room in silence, with eyes fixed on him from every direction. The trial was more than just about a murder. It was about power, arrogance, and the price of silence. For years, Brazil had watched the case unfold, and now it was time to hear the truth. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. They said that Bruno, fearing child support payments and public embarrassment, had orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of his former girlfriend, Eliza Samudio. They described how he had enlisted the help of his cousin Sergio Rosasales, his driver and friend Luiz Enrique Romeo, known as Macareo, and the ex-police officer Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, called Bola. Each man had played a role in carrying out the crime. Bruno was the mastermind, the one who gave the orders. Macareo was the organizer, the one who lured Eliza to her death. Sergio acted as the helper, keeping watch and assisting in her confinement. And Bola, the most feared of them all, was accused of killing her and destroying her body. The prosecution built their argument around witness statements, phone records, and confessions. One of the most important witnesses was Bruno's own cousin, Sergio. He told investigators that Eliza had been taken to a house in Esmeraldas, where she was held for several days before being handed over to Bola. Sergio's words were chilling and detailed, describing how Bruno was fully aware of what was happening. He said that Bruno gave orders from afar and later told him that Eliza had disappeared and wouldn't bother him anymore. His statement painted Bruno as the man who planned everything but made others carry it out. The testimony of Bruno's driver, Macareo, was even more powerful. After months of denying any role, he finally confessed. Standing before the court, he admitted to helping Bruno and said that he had taken part in the abduction. He described how they had brought Eliza from Rio de Janeiro to Minas Gerais under false pretenses, pretending Bruno wanted to recognize his son and settle their dispute. Instead, she was locked inside a small room, terrified and beaten. The confession left the courtroom silent. When asked why he did it, Macareo said he had acted out of loyalty. He claimed Bruno had told him Eliza was destroying his career and needed to be dealt with. The confession linked every piece of evidence together. Even with no body, the case against Bruno was strong. Forensic experts presented traces of blood found in the house where Eliza was last seen. Phone records placed Bruno and his accomplices at critical locations. The baby, found alive with Bruno's relatives, was living proof that Eliza had been with them. The prosecutors argued that Bruno's calm behavior and attempts to mislead investigators were signs of guilt. He had played football matches and given interviews while knowing what had happened to the mother of his child. Bruno's defense tried to argue otherwise. His lawyers insisted there was no direct proof of murder, since the body was never recovered. They claimed the confessions were inconsistent and obtained under pressure. Bruno himself maintained his innocence. During his testimony, he appeared composed but cold. He denied ordering anyone to harm Eliza, saying that she had left on her own. He called the accusations lies created by the media. But his words lacked conviction, and the public no longer believed him. Every time he spoke, people outside the courthouse shouted for justice. The trial stretched on for weeks. Each day brought new witnesses and painful details. The court heard about Eliza's final days, the cruelty she endured, and how her death had been planned. Journalists described the atmosphere as tense and emotional. Eliza's mother attended almost every session, clutching photos of her daughter. When prosecutors read the final messages Eliza had sent to friends before disappearing, the courtroom fell silent. She had written that she feared for her life, that Bruno's people were following her, and that she hoped someone would take care of her baby if something happened to her. Those messages became haunting proof of what she had sensed all along. In March 2013, the verdict was delivered. After years of investigation and public pressure, the judge found Bruno Fernandez guilty of kidnapping, murdering, and hiding the body of Eliza Samudio. He was sentenced to 22 years and 3 months in prison. The courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in anger. His accomplices also received heavy sentences. Macareo was sentenced to 15 years for his part in the crime. Bola, accused of strangling and dismembering Eliza, was convicted separately and given a long prison term. Bruno's cousin Sergio, who had cooperated with authorities, received a lighter sentence, but lived under constant fear. Years later, he would be found dead under suspicious circumstances, another dark twist in a case already filled with tragedy. Bruno's sentencing marked the end of one of Brazil's most shocking criminal cases. For the public, it was a lesson in how fame can conceal cruelty. For Eliza's family, it was justice, though incomplete. Her body was never found, and the full truth of her final moments remained uncertain. The baby she left behind grew up with her mother, far away from the spotlight, carrying a name that once made headlines. After his conviction, Bruno spent several years behind bars, but remained a controversial figure. At one point, he was briefly released due to legal appeals, and even signed with a local football club. The move caused national outrage. Crowds protested, demanding that a man convicted of such a brutal crime should never be allowed to return to professional sports. Under pressure, the club ended the contract, and Bruno returned to prison. His attempt to rebuild his career failed, leaving him isolated and disgraced. The story of Bruno Fernandez and Eliza Samudio became one of Brazil's most infamous true crimes. It revealed the worst side of power, the belief that fame could protect someone from consequences. It also exposed the dangers faced by women who speak up against abuse and injustice. In the end, Eliza's courage to demand recognition for her son cost her life, but it also exposed the truth about a man who thought he was untouchable. Her voice, silenced by violence, still echoed through the courtrooms, the headlines, and the hearts of those who followed her story. What remained was a haunting reminder that behind the glamour of success can hide a darkness no one wants to see. In the heart of Bologna, a quiet Italian city, a love story spiraled into horror. A woman seeking peace, a man consumed by obsession, and a final night that shocked a nation. This is not fiction. It's the chilling true case of footballer Giovanni Padovani and Alessandro Matuzzi. In the quiet, sunlit streets of Bologna, Italy, summer evenings often hum with conversation and the soft clatter of bicycles. But on the night of August 23, 2022, those sounds were shattered by screams that would soon echo across the country. This is the story of a woman who tried to protect herself, a man consumed by obsession, and a tragedy that exposed once again how love can twist into violence when control becomes a motive. Alessandra Matuzzi was 56 years old. She lived alone in a modest but pleasant apartment building on Via dell'Arcoveggio, a residential area in northern Bologna. She worked as a sales representative for a fashion showroom, well liked by her colleagues for her professionalism and kindness. She was independent, steady, and proud of the life she had built. Friends described her as warm and careful, someone who gave people the benefit of the doubt but trusted her instincts. In early 2021, she met Giovanni Padovani online. He was 27, a lower league footballer and part-time model from Senigallia, a small town in central Italy. Giovanni had a promising athletic start, playing for smaller clubs across the country, including teams in Sicily. He was tall, fit, and charismatic, the kind of man who knew how to impress. Their first conversations were lively and easy. For Alessandra, who had spent years focused on work and family, the relationship brought excitement and affection. For Giovanni, it seemed like a chance to find someone who admired him deeply. But behind the charm, there were signs of insecurity, questions about who she was with, why she didn't answer messages quickly, and where she went after work. At first, Alessandra brushed it off as ordinary jealousy. Soon, it began to dominate every conversation. Friends later recalled that the relationship grew tense within months. Giovanni wanted constant contact. He called and texted incessantly, asking for video calls to check on her. When Alessandra didn't answer, he accused her of hiding something. His mood swung between tenderness and anger, and Alessandra found herself walking on eggshells to avoid arguments. By early 2022, she decided to end the relationship. She told him it was over, that she needed peace, that love couldn't survive under pressure. But Giovanni refused to accept it. What Alessandra saw as a breakup, he saw as betrayal. Over the next few months, Giovanni's behavior escalated. He started showing up unannounced, sending long, emotional messages, and calling at all hours. He created new social media accounts to follow her after being blocked. Friends urged her to go to the police. Alessandra hesitated at first, hoping he would calm down, but his obsession only grew. He accused her of seeing someone else, sent threatening voice notes, and even damaged property near her building. Neighbors saw him lurking around the entrance more than once. By July, Alessandra's patience had turned to fear. On July 29, 2022, she filed a formal complaint at the Bologna Carabinieri station, reporting Giovanni for harassment and stalking. In her statement, she described the repeated threats, his sudden appearances outside her home, and her growing fear that he might attack her. The police opened a file and forwarded it to the prosecutor's office, but legal procedures in Italy often take time. A restraining order or protective measure requires a hearing and evidence review. Alessandra was told to stay vigilant and call the authorities if he returned. It was a system designed to protect, but in this case, it moved too slowly. Meanwhile, Giovanni's football career was faltering. He had been training with a team in Sicily, but began missing practices. Those close to him noticed he seemed distracted, consumed by personal issues. He confided to teammates that he had to fix something in Bologna. Days before the murder, he told his coach he needed time off for family matters, and left town without explanation. On the afternoon of August 23rd, Giovanni took a train from Sicily to Bologna. Security footage later showed him carrying a heavy backpack. He arrived at Alessandra's neighborhood before sunset and waited. Residents remembered seeing a man pacing near the gate of her apartment complex, wearing dark clothes and looking agitated. Alessandra, unaware he was there, went about her usual evening routine. Around 9 p.m., she left work, stopped briefly at a friend's, and then drove home. She parked her car and called her sister, Stefania, to chat while unlocking the gate. It was something she often did. Talking on the phone gave her comfort as she walked the short distance to her door. The street was quiet, the light dim. Then, out of the shadows, Giovanni appeared. He began shouting her name, demanding to talk. Startled, Alessandra told him to leave her alone. Stefania, still on the phone, could hear the rising tension in her sister's voice. Then came the sound of shouting, a struggle, and a scream. The line went silent. What happened next was brutal. Giovanni attacked Alessandra in the courtyard using his fists, feet, and whatever objects he could find. An iron bench, a hammer. Neighbors rushed to their windows at the noise. Some screamed for help, others called the police. By the time officers arrived, Alessandra was lying unconscious on the ground, her body severely injured. Paramedics tried to revive her, but the injuries to her head and face were catastrophic. She was taken to Maggiore Hospital, where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Giovanni didn't run. He was still there when police arrived, sitting near her body in shock. He said little. Officers arrested him immediately and took him into custody. Forensics recovered his blood-stained clothes and the hammer used in the assault. Witnesses described his expression as blank, almost detached, as if he didn't fully grasp what he had done. In the police car, when asked why he did it, he muttered that she had ruined his life. The murder of Alessandra Mattuzzi horrified Italy. News channels played recordings of neighbors describing the scene and broadcast interviews with her friends and family, who had feared something like this might happen. Journalists questioned how a woman who had filed a formal complaint just weeks earlier could still be so vulnerable. Politicians called for faster legal processes to protect victims of stalking and domestic violence. The story struck a nerve in a country already struggling with rising cases of femicide. Women killed by partners or ex-partners. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together Giovanni's movements. They found text messages and social media posts showing a clear obsession and premeditation. He had looked up train schedules, saved Alessandra's address, and carried the hammer with him from Sicily. To prosecutors, it was proof that this was not a crime of sudden rage, but a calculated act. They also uncovered his history of controlling behavior and repeated attempts to contact Alessandra even after she blocked him. Everything pointed to a man who couldn't accept rejection, driven by the belief that if he couldn't have her, no one else should. For Stefania, the memory of that phone call never faded. In interviews, she said she felt helpless listening to her sister's last moments. Her voice trembled as she described shouting her name into the phone, hoping someone nearby would hear. "I couldn't do anything," she said. "She told me she saw him. Then I heard her scream. Then nothing." The murder of Alessandra Mattuzzi sent shockwaves through Bologna. The next morning, reporters gathered outside the quiet apartment building where the attack had happened. Cameras pointed toward the courtyard gate, now wrapped in police tape. Residents stood silently on their balconies, some leaving flowers on the steps. The story spread quickly, first across local news, then throughout Italy. A 56-year-old woman, beaten to death by her ex-boyfriend, a 27-year-old footballer who couldn't accept rejection. It sounded tragically familiar. Another headline in the growing list of femicides that Italy had been struggling to confront. Inside the Bologna police headquarters, investigators worked through the night piecing together what had happened. They reviewed phone records, security camera footage, and witness statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Cameras from nearby buildings showed Giovanni Padovani waiting outside Alessandra's home for hours before she arrived. He wasn't wandering aimlessly or acting on impulse. He had been watching, pacing, waiting. When officers searched his backpack, they found the hammer, gloves, and a change of clothes, items that left little doubt about premeditation. There were also printed photos of Alessandra, notes he had written to himself, and messages that prosecutors would later describe as the mind of a man possessed by obsession. In the interrogation room, Giovanni remained quiet at first. He appeared detached, sometimes confused, then defensive. When asked why he was in Bologna, he said he had come to talk to her, to make her listen. But his idea of talking had already turned to violence long before that night. Officers noted that he didn't express remorse, only frustration. He complained that Alessandra had ignored him and embarrassed him. To the investigators, it was clear he viewed her independence as a personal insult. What stood out was how ordinary his words sounded. Jealousy, control, entitlement. The very things Alessandra had described in her complaint a month earlier. While Giovanni remained in custody, Alessandra's family began the painful process of confronting what had happened. Her sister Stefania, who had been on the phone during the attack, gave her first interview days later. Her voice shook as she recounted the moment she realized her sister was being killed on the other end of the line. "I heard her scream," she said softly. "Then the phone went silent. I called her name over and over, but she didn't answer." Those words appeared on television screens across Italy, haunting in their simplicity. At the same time, the story reignited national anger about Italy's response to stalking and domestic violence. Alessandra had done everything she was supposed to do. She reported the threats. She documented his behavior. She went to the authorities. Yet she still ended up unprotected. Journalists began asking hard questions about how such cases were handled. Legal experts explained that while Italy had laws against stalking, enforcement was often slow because each case required a court's approval for preventive measures. Protective orders could take weeks or even months to process. By the time paperwork moved, victims were often left exposed. Politicians promised reforms, but for Alessandra's family, those promises came too late. In Bologna, the prosecutor's office began building a case that would show not only Giovanni's guilt, but also the deliberate nature of his actions. They reconstructed his timeline, leaving Sicily, buying a train ticket to Bologna, carrying a hammer, and waiting for Alessandra for hours. Each step spoke of intent. The lead prosecutor called it an execution driven by obsession. To strengthen their case, they collected every message Giovanni had sent her. The text showed escalating desperation, pleas, insults, and threats. In one, he warned her that there would be consequences if she didn't speak to him. In another, he accused her of ruining his life. Alessandra never replied to most of them. She had blocked him, hoping silence would make him give up. Instead, the silence enraged him further. News reports described Giovanni's background in detail. He had grown up in a small town on the Adriatic coast, played football since childhood, and drifted through several minor clubs in Italy's lower divisions. His teammates remembered him as intense but quiet, sometimes withdrawn. He had posted photos of himself training and modeling, presenting an image of discipline and confidence. But behind the scenes, those who knew him said he struggled with insecurity and jealousy, especially in relationships. When the story broke, former coaches and teammates were stunned. "We knew he was emotional," one said, "but no one imagined something like this." As the investigation progressed, the evidence of premeditation deepened. Technicians examined Giovanni's phone and computer. They found search histories for Alessandra's address, train schedules to Bologna, and even online articles about restraining orders. He had studied the system that was meant to stop him. Psychologists later described his behavior as coercive obsession, a mix of control, humiliation, and possessive love. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow build toward violence. In the weeks following the murder, Bologna mourned. Hundreds of people attended Alessandra's funeral. The church overflowed with flowers, her colleagues from the showroom carrying white roses. Stefania, standing at the front, held a photo of her sister smiling. Reporters waited outside, cameras lowered in silence. The priest spoke of courage and awareness, urging people to recognize the signs of control before it turns to tragedy. Outside, candles lined the sidewalk. Many who came didn't know Alessandra personally, but said they felt they owed her a goodbye. Meanwhile, Giovanni's family in Senegalia kept a low profile. His parents released a brief statement expressing sorrow for Alessandra's death and apologizing to her family. They said they couldn't understand what had driven their son to such violence. Back in Bologna, investigators continued gathering witness accounts. Neighbors testified that they had seen Giovanni near the building before, sometimes watching from across the street. One neighbor recalled hearing Alessandra tell him to leave her alone weeks before the murder. Another remembered him ringing her buzzer repeatedly. Each testimony painted the same picture: a woman trying to reclaim her peace and a man unwilling to let her go. By late 2022, prosecutors formally charged Giovanni Padovani with aggravated murder and stalking, emphasizing premeditation and cruelty. The indictment stated that he had acted with full awareness and intent to kill, and that the attack was preceded by months of psychological persecution. He was transferred to a high-security prison in Bologna to await trial. During preliminary hearings, his defense suggested he was emotionally unstable and had acted in a moment of desperation. The prosecution rejected that narrative, arguing that every step he took proved careful planning. While the legal process began, the case remained a national topic. Talk shows discussed the failure of protective systems. Activists held vigils in Alessandra's name, carrying signs that read "Stop Femicide," and she asked for help. Each new headline reignited the public's anger. The Ministry of Justice announced plans to speed up protective orders for victims of stalking and harassment, but many saw it as too little, too late. Back in the courtroom, Giovanni appeared thinner, quieter, his once confident demeanor replaced by silence. He listened as prosecutors described in detail the attack, the waiting, the hammer, the phone call to Stefania, the neighbor's screams. Witness after witness painted a picture of premeditated brutality. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Alessandra had suffered multiple blows to the head and face, consistent with repeated strikes from a blunt object. It was one of the most violent femicides Bologna had ever seen. For Alessandra's family, sitting through the hearings was unbearable. Stefania attended each session, holding her sister's photo. She wanted justice, but also answers. How the system could have allowed this to happen even after Alessandra's formal complaint. Her voice became one of the most recognized in Italy's growing movement against gender-based violence. She spoke at rallies, urging authorities to act faster when women report threats. Her message was clear: my sister did everything right and still she died. Months turned into a year as the trial prepared to move forward. The media followed every development closely, describing it not just as a murder case, but as a symbol of systemic failure. Legal experts debated whether the country's stalking laws needed stronger enforcement. Politicians pledged reforms. But in the courtroom, the focus remained on the facts, what Giovanni had done, what Alessandra had endured, and how a relationship that began with affection had turned into horror. By early 2024, the court sessions were ready to begin. The prosecutors were confident their case was airtight. The defense prepared to argue emotional instability and lack of intent. The stage was set for a trial that would reveal the full story behind the murder, how a young man's obsession destroyed two families, and how the justice system would finally respond. The outcome was still ahead, but everyone in the courtroom knew what was at stake, not only Giovanni's fate, but also a statement about the value of a woman's life and the cost of a society too slow to protect her. When the trial of Giovanni Padovani finally began in early 2024, the courtroom in Bologna was packed. Reporters filled the benches, survivors' advocacy groups stood outside with banners, and Alessandra Mattuzzi's family sat silently in the front row. It had been more than a year since the night she was killed, yet the pain felt as sharp as ever. The courtroom air carried the weight of everything that had been lost. Not just a life, but a sense of safety that every woman should have when she says no. The prosecutors opened with precision. They laid out a timeline built from phone data, train tickets, surveillance footage, and witness testimony. Each detail pointed toward the same conclusion. Giovanni had planned the attack. He left his team in Sicily days earlier, bought a hammer, and traveled across the country to Bologna. He waited for hours outside Alessandra's home, hidden in the shadows, until she returned from work. When she arrived, he struck without hesitation. The prosecutors described it not as a crime of passion, but as a deliberate act fueled by control and obsession. They read aloud some of Giovanni's final messages, ones filled with jealousy, anger, and entitlement. Each word echoed through the courtroom, underscoring the pattern Alessandra had reported weeks before her death. Giovanni sat motionless throughout most of the hearings, wearing plain prison clothes, his hair shorter than in his football days. Sometimes he looked at the floor, sometimes straight ahead, but never toward Alessandra's family. When given a chance to speak, he offered no full confession, only fragmented statements. He said he lost control, that he didn't remember everything, and that he wanted to talk, not kill. But the evidence contradicted his words at every turn. The hammer he carried, The hours he waited, and the sheer brutality of the attack told a different story. The judges listened carefully, but the courtroom could feel the truth. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a decision. Witnesses described the horror of that night in vivid, painful detail. Neighbors told the court how they heard screams and saw Giovanni hitting Alessandra again and again, even after she had fallen. One woman broke down, crying, as she recalled the sound of metal striking concrete. Stefania, Alessandra's sister, gave the most emotional testimony. She recounted the phone call, hearing her sister's frightened voice, the shouting, the silence. The court fell silent as she spoke, her voice trembling but steady. She was asking for help, Stefania said, and I couldn't reach her. Every person in that room could feel the weight of her words. The defense tried to argue mental distress, claiming Giovanni had been suffering from psychological instability and emotional dependency. They said his behavior was driven by desperation, not hatred. But the psychological experts appointed by the court rejected that claim. They described Giovanni as emotionally possessive, but fully aware of his actions. He understood right from wrong, they said, and had planned each step. The presiding judge asked the expert whether Giovanni had any mental illness that impaired judgment. The answer was clear: no. His actions were conscious and deliberate. Prosecutors emphasized Alessandra's repeated efforts to seek help. The police complaint filed just weeks before her death, the text messages she shared with friends expressing fear, the neighbors who had witnessed his stalking. All those warnings, they said, had been ignored or delayed. The courtroom felt a shared sense of frustration. Alessandra had done everything a person is told to do: report, document, stay alert. Yet, nothing had protected her. The prosecutor called it a failure of protection and a triumph of obsession. After weeks of hearings, the trial concluded in February 2024. The judges retired to deliberate, and when they returned, the verdict was delivered in a quiet, heavy voice. Giovanni Padovani was found guilty of aggravated murder and stalking, with premeditation and cruelty as aggravating factors. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The words hung in the air for a moment, followed by the faint sound of Stefania's sobbing. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in applause, not for joy, but for justice finally served. Reporters called it one of the most significant femicide verdicts in recent Italian history. But the story did not end there. Giovanni's lawyers appealed, hoping to reduce the sentence by arguing that the attack was impulsive. The appeals court in Bologna reviewed the case in November 2024. Once again, the evidence stood firm. The court confirmed the life sentence, ruling that Giovanni's actions were not spontaneous, but calculated and merciless. They stated plainly that the crime showed clear intent to kill, preceded by stalking and harassment, carried out with brutal persistence. The judgment reinforced what everyone already knew. Alessandra's death was not a sudden tragedy, but the outcome of obsession allowed to grow unchecked. The final chapter came in September 2025, when Italy's Supreme Court in Rome issued its ruling. The judges upheld every point of the conviction, leaving no room for further appeal. Giovanni Padovani would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Alessandra's family, the decision closed a long and painful legal journey. It did not bring peace, but it brought finality. Outside the courthouse, Stefania spoke briefly to reporters. "My sister can't come back," she said softly, "but at least the law has spoken for her. Now, I just hope no one else has to die waiting to be believed." The case of Alessandra Mattuzzi became a symbol in Italy, a reminder of the consequences of ignoring early signs of violence, of systems too slow to act, and of a society forced to face how often women's fears are dismissed until it's too late. Her story inspired new discussions in Parliament about faster protective measures for stalking victims. Advocacy groups used her name in campaigns against gender-based violence, calling for education, prevention, and accountability. In Bologna, near her building, a small plaque was placed at the entrance where she was killed. It read simply, "In memory of Alessandra, who asked for help and was not heard." Every year since, people have left flowers and candles there. Neighbors pause for a moment when they pass, remembering the woman whose kindness once filled that courtyard. Giovanni Padovani, once a promising athlete, will live out his days behind prison walls. A man who lost everything to his own obsession. Alessandra Matuzzi's life ended brutally, but her story continues to speak for countless others who never get the chance. In the end, her name stands not as a headline, but as a warning and a call for change. The justice that came too late for her now carries a message that echoes beyond Bologna, that no cry for help should ever go unheard again. A rising football star, a late-night drive through Madrid, and a single reckless decision that changed everything. What began as a night of celebration ended in tragedy, leaving one young woman dead and a promising career forever stained. This is the true story of Marcos Alonso's fatal 2011 crash. It was the early hours of May 2, 2011, in Madrid, Spain. The city was still alive with the faint pulse of nightlife. Street lights shimmered off wet asphalt, and taxis drifted through the nearly empty roads. Among the few cars moving through the quiet morning was a black BMW carrying 5 young people, friends who had spent the night celebrating, unaware of how quickly joy would turn to tragedy. The driver was Marcos Alonso Mendoza, a 20-year-old Spanish footballer who played professionally for Bolton Wanderers in the English Premier League. Marcos was tall, athletic, and confident, a young man with a growing reputation in European football. He had come home to Madrid during a short break, spending time with friends before returning to England. The others in the car were around his age, close-knit companions from his circle in Madrid. Sitting beside him in the front passenger seat was 22-year-old Yaiza Cantera, a university student known for her calm nature. In the back seat were 22-year-old Angela Vidales, 22-year-old Maria Rodriguez, and 21-year-old Pablo Iglesias. They were all in their early 20s, full of life and plans, just a group of friends enjoying the freedom of youth. They had spent the night at a popular Madrid nightclub, a place where laughter, music, and drinks flowed easily. Marcos had been drinking, though not to the point of losing control, or so he thought. He was relaxed, smiling, and carefree. His friends trusted him behind the wheel. After all, he was successful, confident, and seemed in control. But what they didn't know was that the mix of alcohol, speed, and wet roads was about to become deadly. As they left the club, the city was quieting down. The rain had left the road slick, reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. Marcos started the car, the sound of the engine echoing through the street. He accelerated gently at first, talking and laughing with his friends, who played music on a low volume. The night felt endless, but it was about to end abruptly. Witnesses later described seeing a car moving too fast for the conditions. Marcos was driving through central Madrid, heading toward the M30 Ring Road, a major route that circles the city. The speed limit there was 50 kilometers per hour. Marcos was driving at more than twice that speed, around 112 kilometers per hour, according to later reports. His blood alcohol level would later be found at 0.93 milligrams per milliliter, nearly double the legal limit in Spain. In that moment, none of that mattered to him. He was laughing, feeling young and untouchable. Inside the car, the atmosphere was still lighthearted. The friends were tired but cheerful, talking about the night, their favorite songs, and weekend plans. Maria Rodriguez, sitting behind the driver, wasn't wearing her seatbelt. It was a small detail that would become the difference between life and death. As the car approached a curved section of the M30 near Moncloa, Marcos pressed the accelerator. The BMW picked up speed, cutting through the wet air. The tires struggled for grip on the slick road. In an instant, the car began to drift. Marcos tried to correct the steering, but it was too late. The car spun out of control, skidding sideways. The sound of screeching tires and metal scraping against concrete broke the silence of the early morning. The BMW slammed into a wall and then hit another obstacle with tremendous force. The impact crumpled the rear side of the car, trapping the passengers inside. Emergency calls flooded in within seconds. Nearby drivers stopped, horrified by what they saw. A black car crushed against the barrier, steam rising from the engine, shattered glass scattered across the asphalt. One witness later recalled seeing a young man, dazed and bleeding slightly, trying to open the driver's door. That was Marcos Alonso. He stumbled out, shocked, his clothes wet with rain and smoke from the airbags. His friends were screaming, injured, and disoriented. In the back seat, Maria Rodriguez was motionless. Paramedics arrived minutes later. The scene was chaotic, flashing lights, rain, the hum of police radios. Marcos was in shock, trying to explain what had happened. He kept asking about his friends. Angela and Pablo were conscious, but injured, both suffering from cuts and bruises. Yaiza had a head wound, but was stable. The paramedics turned their attention to Maria, who was critically hurt. They worked quickly, performing CPR and trying to stabilize her. But her injuries were too severe. She had suffered head and chest trauma from the impact. Despite their efforts, she died shortly afterward, still trapped in the car she had entered with laughter only minutes earlier. The police began their investigation at the scene. They noted the speed, the skid marks, and the crushed side of the car. Marcos was asked to take a breath test. The results showed he was well over the legal alcohol limit. The officers took him into custody for questioning, marking the start of a criminal case that would follow him for years. The once celebratory night was now a crime scene. A 20-year-old athlete who had everything to look forward to was suddenly facing the weight of a life lost. News of the crash spread quickly through Madrid that morning. When authorities confirmed that the driver was Marcos Alonso, the footballer for Bolton Wanderers and a former Real Madrid youth player, the story became national news. Reporters gathered outside the hospital and police station. Fans and locals were shocked. A young sportsman, known for his promise and discipline on the field, now connected to a fatal drunk driving crash. Marcos's parents, both living in Spain, arrived immediately. His father, Marcos Alonso Pena, a respected former footballer who had played for Barcelona and Atletico Madrid, was devastated. He stood outside the police station, silent, refusing to speak to the press. The family of Maria Rodriguez was also informed. Their grief was unimaginable. A daughter just 22, full of plans and dreams, was gone in an instant because of someone else's mistake. Later that morning, forensic investigators examined the wreckage. The crushed side of the car told the story clearly. The high speed, the loss of control, the force of the impact. The airbags had deployed, but it wasn't enough to save Maria. The others had survived because they were strapped in. The difference between life and death had been a seatbelt and a decision to drive under the influence. At the police station, Marcos sat quietly during questioning. He admitted to having had drinks earlier in the night and acknowledged that he was driving too fast. He didn't try to deny what happened. He looked pale, distant, and remorseful. When asked about Maria, he broke down, repeating that he never meant for anyone to get hurt. His friends, still recovering in the hospital, confirmed that he hadn't seemed drunk, but had been driving faster than usual. By the end of the day, the case was formally recorded as a suspected reckless homicide, homicidio imprudente under Spanish law. It meant that while Marcos hadn't intended to kill anyone, his negligent behavior, speeding and driving under the influence, had caused the death. The police impounded the car and collected evidence for the prosecutor's office. The autopsy confirmed that Maria's cause of death was severe trauma consistent with a high-speed crash. In the days that followed, Madrid mourned quietly. Newspapers published photographs of the wrecked BMW and the young footballer being escorted by police. The headlines were harsh but factual. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. The story captured the dangers of drunk driving, especially among young people who felt invincible. Football fans debated whether Alonso's career was over. Others focused on the human side, the loss of Maria, the pain of both families, and the irreversible consequences of one decision. As the investigation moved forward, more details emerged about that night. The group's time at the nightclub, the drinks they shared, the route they took home, and the conditions on the road. Everything pointed to a single devastating truth, that a moment of carelessness could destroy multiple lives. Marcos Alonso, once a symbol of promise and talent, was now the central figure in a case that would haunt him for years to come. The story of success and celebration had turned into one of loss, regret, and accountability, setting the stage for the long legal and emotional journey that lay ahead. In the days after the crash, Madrid was filled with unease. The city had seen its share of road accidents, but this one hit differently. It involved a young professional footballer, someone admired and envied, whose mistake had cost a life. Newspapers printed his photo beside the mangled remains of his BMW. Reporters stood outside the courthouse and hospital, waiting for any update. The public was divided. Some saw him as a reckless athlete who thought fame made him untouchable, while others saw a frightened 20-year-old who made a terrible mistake and would live with it forever. Marcos Alonso spent the first night after the crash in police custody. He wasn't in handcuffs, but his face showed the shock of someone still trying to understand what had happened. Officers questioned him for hours about how much he'd drunk, where he had been, and how fast he was driving. He admitted he'd had drinks at a nightclub before getting behind the wheel. His blood alcohol test, confirmed by forensic results, left no doubt. He was over the legal limit. Investigators also determined that the car had been traveling at roughly 112 kilometers per hour in a 50 zone. The evidence was strong, and the case was officially classified as a reckless homicide caused by drunk driving. Maria Rodriguez's family was grieving in silence. Her parents, both middle-aged professionals from Madrid, avoided cameras and public comments. They described her as a kind, lively girl who loved art and travel, and who had been planning a summer trip before the crash. Her friends spoke of her as someone full of laughter, the kind of person who brightened every room. Now her name was being repeated on every news channel in Spain as the victim of the Alonso crash. The family wanted justice, not attention. They refused to turn the tragedy into spectacle, though they followed the case closely, wanting to make sure her death would not be brushed aside because of the driver's fame. The other passengers, Yaiza, Angela, and Pablo, were recovering from their injuries, both physical and emotional. They were questioned by police soon after leaving the hospital. Their statements matched Marcos's version. They had gone out together, had drinks, and Marcos had insisted he was fine to drive. They remembered the music playing, the laughter, and then the sudden loss of control. Angela recalled screaming as the car started spinning. Pablo said he remembered only the sound of metal hitting concrete before blacking out. None of them had expected the night to end the way it did. As the investigation moved ahead, the public prosecutor reviewed the evidence: the speed report, the blood alcohol test, the autopsy, and the crash reconstruction. Everything pointed to negligence. It wasn't intentional, but it was criminally careless. In Spain, reckless homicide carried the possibility of prison time, license suspension, and heavy fines. For Marcos, this meant facing the end of his young career and possibly years behind bars. Meanwhile, the football world reacted with mixed emotions. Bolton Wanderers, his club in England, released a brief statement expressing shock and offering condolences to the victim's family. They also said they would support Marcos through the legal process. Back in Madrid, Real Madrid, the club where he had once trained as a youth player, remained quiet. Some fans on social media were harsh, calling for his immediate suspension and punishment. Others defended him, saying that anyone could make a tragic mistake and that he deserved a chance to rebuild his life. Marcos was released on bail a few days later, pending trial. He looked drained, thinner, and spoke little to the media. Cameras followed him as he left the courthouse beside his father. The older Alonso walked closely beside his son, shielding him from reporters. The family hired experienced lawyers, knowing the case would attract attention. They advised Marcos to stay silent and let the process take its course. For months, the case moved through Spain's slow legal system. The prosecutor gathered technical reports, medical findings, and witness statements. The defense team worked quietly to demonstrate that Marcos had cooperated fully and shown deep remorse. He visited Maria's family privately through intermediaries, expressing his regret and offering compensation, though the family's main focus remained accountability. In the public eye, time passed, but the memory of the crash lingered. Each time Marcos appeared in public, the shadow of the tragedy followed him. Friends who had once celebrated with him now kept their distance. He stayed away from nightlife, rarely spoke, and trained quietly when possible. For a time, he avoided interviews and cameras, preferring silence over explanations. Those close to him said he barely smiled. He wasn't the confident, cheerful young man from before. The weight of guilt had settled deeply. The following year, when the formal indictment was filed, it detailed every fact of the case: the time of the crash, the alcohol reading, the speed, and the exact injuries Maria suffered. It described his decision to drive as a voluntary act of negligence that created a foreseeable risk. The wording was cold, legal, and final. Marcos's lawyers prepared to argue that he had not acted with intent, that it was a tragic mistake deserving of a lighter sentence. But the evidence was unshakable. As the court date approached, the case once again drew media coverage. Journalists revisited the story, showing images of the crash site, the damaged wall on the M30, and the photos of the car. Commentators spoke about how Spain's laws on drunk driving had grown stricter and how athletes, as public figures, carried an extra responsibility. Some television programs framed it as a cautionary tale about fame, youth, and the illusion of control. For Maria's family, no legal outcome could replace what was lost. Her parents attended every hearing, quiet but present. Friends placed flowers near the crash site each year, a small memorial on the side of the road. For them, her story wasn't about a footballer or a case. It was about a daughter who should still be alive. As the case reached the court's final stages, both sides prepared for a decision that would define the rest of Marcos Alonso's life. The young man who once seemed destined for football greatness was now waiting to hear how the law would judge his actions that night. The moment of truth was drawing near, and nothing could undo what had already been done. The celebration that began in laughter had ended in silence, and the path forward would depend entirely on what the court decided next. The courtroom in Madrid was quiet on the morning Marcos Alonso appeared to face judgment. Years had passed since that night in 2011, but the tragedy had never faded. The case had moved slowly through Spain's legal system, as most do, delayed by appeals, paperwork, and negotiations between lawyers. When Alonso finally stood before the judge, the young man once known for his confidence on the football pitch looked subdued and weary. He wasn't the rising star the public once knew. He was a man marked by guilt and regret. The prosecutors presented their case firmly, but without sensationalism. They laid out the facts that had been established through months of investigation. The car's speed at 112 kilometers per hour, the legal limit of 50, the alcohol level nearly double what was permitted, and the condition of a road that night. They showed photographs of the wrecked BMW, police diagrams of the crash, and forensic reports detailing the injuries that had taken Maria Rodriguez's life. The evidence was undeniable. The prosecutor's argument was simple. Marcos Alonso had driven recklessly while intoxicated, and his actions had caused a death that could have been prevented. Maria's parents sat quietly through the proceedings. They had chosen not to make public statements. Their silence carried more weight than words. Their daughter's name echoed in the courtroom as witnesses described her final moments, and each mention was another reminder of what had been taken from them. Angela Vidales and Pablo Iglesias, two of the surviving passengers, gave statements confirming the events of that night. They spoke of laughter, music, and the sudden terror of losing control. Angela recalled the sound of the crash, the darkness afterward, and the moment she realized Maria wasn't responding. Both friends struggled to speak, their voices low but steady. When it was his turn, Marcos Alonso addressed the court. His tone was soft, measured, and heavy with remorse. He admitted he had made a terrible mistake and that nothing could undo what happened. He said he lived every day with the weight of Maria's death and would carry it for the rest of his life. He expressed his condolences to her family, saying he understood that no apology could bring peace, but he still wanted to say he was sorry. The courtroom remained silent as he spoke. Even those who had come expecting excuses heard none. His confession wasn't a defense. It was an acceptance of responsibility. His lawyers argued for leniency, emphasizing his cooperation, lack of criminal record, and sincere remorse. They presented letters of good character from teammates, coaches, and family members who described him as respectful and disciplined. They also showed proof that he had privately compensated Maria's family and had followed all restrictions placed upon him since the incident. They asked the court to consider his age at the time and the fact that he had already suffered immense personal and professional consequences. The judge listened carefully. In Spain, reckless homicide in traffic cases is treated seriously but allows for reduced sentences if there's no intent to harm and if the offender demonstrates genuine remorse. After reviewing all arguments, the court ruled that Marcos Alonso was guilty of reckless homicide. The judge stated that his decision to drive drunk and at such a high speed created a clear and foreseeable risk, one that directly led to the fatal crash. The courtroom remained still as the sentence was read, 21 months in prison, converted into a fine because it was his first offense, and the term was under 2 years. He was also banned from driving for 3 years and 4 months, and ordered to pay 61,000 euros in compensation. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, arguing that a life lost deserved a harsher penalty. Others believed it was fair within the limits of Spanish law, and that Alonso's remorse and cooperation had been genuine. For Maria's family, no punishment could measure up to their loss. They accepted the ruling quietly, not out of forgiveness, but out of exhaustion. Years of court hearings and reliving the worst night of their lives had drained them. They wanted peace, not more headlines. After the case ended, Marcos Alonso stayed out of the spotlight for a while. He focused on rebuilding his career and his life. His transfer to Fiorentina in Italy marked a new chapter, though the shadow of Madrid followed him everywhere. Reporters occasionally brought up the accident, and each mention reopened old wounds. But on the field, he worked hard, disciplined and serious, avoiding the nightlife that had once tempted him. In time, his talent earned him a move to Chelsea FC in England, where he became one of Europe's respected left-backs. Yet, despite his professional success, those close to him said he remained quieter, more reserved, a man forever changed. The story of that night in 2011 became a lasting reminder in Spain about the dangers of drunk driving. It wasn't just a footballer scandal. It was a lesson in how quickly life can turn from celebration to catastrophe. Schools and driving safety campaigns used the case as an example, emphasizing that talent, fame, or wealth offer no protection from the consequences of reckless choices. The crash had taken one life, but its impact stretched far beyond one family. It changed the lives of everyone in that car, especially the young man who had been behind the wheel. In later interviews, Marcos never avoided the topic when asked directly. He didn't try to rewrite the past or defend himself. He spoke simply, saying he would never forget what happened and that it would always be part of who he was. Those who knew him said that his guilt never left him, but that he channeled it into focus and discipline, trying to live in a way that honored the responsibility he failed to show that night. Years passed, but the story remained. It stood as both a tragedy and a warning, a single night's decision changing everything for 5 young people. Maria Rodriguez's name is remembered alongside his, not as a statistic, but as a young woman whose life ended too soon. Marcos Alonso continued to play football, watched by millions. But no matter how far his career went, a part of him would always remain on that wet Madrid road, where one careless choice turned into a lifelong burden. The case of the 2011 Marcos Alonso fatal DUI crash is still spoken of in Spain whenever young drivers are reminded to think twice before taking the wheel after drinking. It's a story about loss, accountability, and the irreversible weight of one night's mistake. A story where success, sorrow, and guilt became forever intertwined.